Welcome to Cambridge Forum with Dr. Oliver Sacks. His new book of marvels is called Musicophilia. I'm Christopher Lydon, constant reader and boundless admirer of Oliver Sacks. He is a completely extraordinary character, starting with the fact that we think of Oliver Sacks as a writer, stylist, an inventor of a new form of literature, scientist reporting, reflection, inquiry. He thinks of himself as a doctor, a clinician, going faithfully to his nursing home patients, his hospital, his referrals of exotic cases, and then this vast correspondence with people who write and report their symptoms to him. His genius, as you all know, is mediating between the freak cases and the rest of us, or between the extraordinarily rare cases. I mean, how many men do we know who mistook their wife for a hat? And that normal universal. And so he has done again on the matter of music. He writes well into this book, music, uniquely among the arts, is both completely abstract and profoundly emotional. It has no power to represent anything particular or external, but it has a unique power to express inner states or feelings. Music can pierce the heart directly. It needs no mediation. One does not have to know anything about Dido and Aeneas to be moved by her lament for him. Anyone who has ever lost someone knows what Dido is expressing. And there is finally a deep and mysterious paradox here, for while such music makes one experience pain and grief more intensely, it brings solace and consolation at the same time. It also transcends, and we'll get to the transcendent piece, but I'd like to, with great pleasure, it's a privilege to introduce Oliver Sacks, but to ask him at the outset sort of the Cole Porter question, what is this thing called music? Or in the Raymond Carver mode, what do we talk about when we talk about music? Oliver Sacks.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's a pleasure being here, although the ecclesiastical atmosphere makes me oscillate between feelings of reverence and blasphemy. I'm very grateful to the Harvard bookstore, as one must be for all independent bookstores which still survive in our globalized world. Now, I do in fact start my book with the question which Chris raises, although I put it into the mouth of some Martians or science fiction supermen who are described in the Arthur Clarke book, Childhood's End. These highly cerebral super beings come down to Earth, and amongst other things, they attend a concert. And they listen with great patience and courtesy. They congratulate the composer on his great ingenuity, but they have no idea what went on. Now, rather than try and answer your question, when you asked your question, I found myself thinking of the lines from Eliot, do not ask what is it, let us go and make our visit. And basically, my sort of writing is to give examples. I really don't have much in the way of definitions or systems or general theories. I think I'm going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll chat together. I suspect I was introduced to music in utero because the household was full of music. My older brothers were learning the piano and the clarinet and the flute, and there was chamber music, and especially Bach. And when I was 5 and I was asked what were my favorite things in the world, I said smoked salmon and Bach. I had some smoked salmon at lunch today. 70 years later, things may not have changed that much. But to go back to the quote, I was always doubly tantalized by music. First of all, by its patterns, its symmetries, its proportions, its mathematical perfection and abstractness, and second, by the excruciating pleasure which it could produce, and the sweet pain which was beyond words, beyond concepts, beyond expression by anything else. As a physician, I re-encountered music 40 years ago or so when I met the deeply disabled people whom I later described in Awakenings, these deeply Parkinsonian people who often couldn't initiate a single movement or sound by themselves, but who could be liberated by music in the most amazing way. I once took W.H. Auden, whom I knew in his later days, to see the music sessions with these patients. I took him partly because he was so musical. He wrote the libretto to the Magic Flute and lots of things, and also because his father, George Auden, had been one of the great describers of the sleepy sickness in England in the 1920s. And Auden was amazed when he saw this, and he quoted an aphorism of Novalis, which says, every disease is a musical problem and every cure is a musical solution. This seemed perfectly to fit what was going on there, although I think it's only metaphorical for other things. And then over the years, I saw the great therapeutic power of music with patients of other sorts, those with amnesia, with dementia, with aphasia, with autism, etc. I also encountered, as a physician, people with various musical problems. Some of a negative sort and some of a positive sort. The negative sort were that people would sometimes, after a stroke or a head injury, lose the ability to perceive some aspect of music. The tone, the rhythm, the pitch, the melodic contour, whatever it was. Or sometimes they would perceive music accurately but lose their emotional response to it, but not their emotional response to anything else. And this showed me that there's no one part of the brain which responds to music, but there are many, many parts of the brain, many different networks. Music, in fact, occupies much more of the brain than language or almost anything else, even though it seems to be an exclusively human thing. I know I will be attacked by whale and bird song people for saying that. The other problem, which I believe is not uncommon, has to do with musical hallucinations. I wrote about these in my Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat book. And this sort of opened the floodgates. Many people wrote to a columnist called Dear Abby saying, yes, they too had musical hallucinations. They said they'd never mentioned it to their husband and wife. They were afraid it might connote something awful. They'd been to their doctor who had ignored them. And then Dear Abby asked me if I would comment on these letters. And rightly or wrongly, I did so. And since this time, I've had a Niagara of letters. I would think close to 1,000. And so I think that has been a special sort of problem. So I've written odds and ends about music over the years, but basically since 1990 or so, neuroscience for the first time has interested itself in music. And most of the scientists, most of the neuroscientists who study music are themselves good musicians. So they know music both from the inside and the outside. And there are several of them as a start right here at Harvard. Gottfried Schlaug, Mark Tremo, Alvaro Pascaleone, and others. So this, in fact, has been a hot spot for looking at music and the brain right here. And in the book, I've somehow tried to couple my what for me is, I'm an incontinent storyteller. I can't stop it. And it's, you know, but a lot of medicine consists of stories. People tell me their stories, they give me their lives, and narrative is an essential part. But then, unlike a novelist, one also, though perhaps it's a bit more like a detective story, you have to ask what's going on in the person. Anyhow, I've tried to put things together in the book, and I've said my 5 minutes, and now I'll sit down. Or rather, you will stand up.
You remind me, speaking of cognitive science, you represent a sort of convergence between two aphorisms. Walter Pater, 100 years ago maybe, said that all art aspires to the condition of music. And more recently, Marjorie Garber said that all learning now, all university disciplines aspire to the condition of cognitive science. So here you are at the crossroads. I wanted to, and I'll tell you where I'm going, I want to ask you sort of three different questions. Or would you expand on three different points? One, the evolution of music, music in evolution. Is it an accident? Is it essential? Secondly, I'd like you to expand on the matter of music as therapy and how it works. And then I'm interested in the question of music as transcendence and music as the language of eternity, God's sound, or however we want to phrase it. But would you first just talk about the evolutionary significance of this uniquely human thing? Or as Steve Pinker says, non-significance.
As a clinician, I can only really address the middle question, but I'll have a go at all of them. There have been all sorts of theories and speculations about the origin of music and language and their interactions, at least since the time of Rousseau, who was a composer as well as a writer, and who felt that there had been originally some primal form of expression or discourse which was articulate music, something which was inseparably music and language, and that this then bifurcated or differentiated. Go to jump. William James, whom I adore, and in fact he was called at Harvard that adorable genius. But in the 1,500 pages of the Principles of Psychology, there is one sentence, and that rather dismissive, about music. When he speaks of the susceptibility to music, he says it has no zoological utility, and it is a pure incident of having a hearing organ, he says, like the susceptibility to seasickness. This tone is echoed, if I don't do him an injustice, by Steven Pinker, who has sometimes spoken of music as auditory cheesecake, this to be contrasted with man does not live by bread alone, and similarly has spoken of an absence of biological relevance, and has said that if music disappeared, it would make no difference to us. I disagree. I disagree passionately there, and I think as a start one would have to explain why music exists and is central in every culture known to us, and occupies so many roles, from religious music, to martial music, to dancing, to every sort of music. And why, going back, one can find, say, bone flutes, 50,000 years old, which have tonal intervals somewhat similar to our own. Again, there are some... Steven Pinker and I think William James regard music as a sort of trivial appendage to speech. But there's some aspects of music which have no analogue in speech, and one would have to explain how they could occur. And the clearest one of these, and again uniquely human, is the way in which we all tap or dance or keep time to sound. We keep the pulse, we keep the beat. And even if we don't do, and this occurs spontaneously in all children, but you never see a dancing monkey or a dancing chimpanzee. It depends on anatomical connections unique to the human brain between the auditory and motor parts of the brain. Darwin has a whole chapter about the evolution of music. He thought that it had arisen as part of courtship rituals, but not merely as a fixed code, such as you have with birds, but as a potential for expression beyond any other. He thought that language was secondary to it. What do I know? I can only quote these people. But then what do they know? No one was around. I'm afraid I haven't got past the first question.
No, I just add that Daniel Levitin, and you know him and you cite him, but he makes what seem perfectly obvious points. Not only music is intimately associated with intimacy, with courtship, with sex, with love, with romantic love. I mean, it's in there in the biological chain. But it also, he writes, among other things, that skill at music betokens leisure, betokens wealth, betokens mating attractiveness. I mean, it would seem to be threaded through every aspect of evolution, to my logical eye. And I guess you come out the same place.
Yeah, well, of course, Darwin links it explicitly to sexual selection, but I also think of it as a sort of social cement, which is, we couldn't do without. Yeah.
You know the therapy of music so well. I simply wonder, and we all have experienced changes of mood, changes of lifting of depression. I think of my mother. The last time I saw my mother, she was on the verge of 93, and she had lost a great deal of memory. But I said, Mom, she was always a wonderful singer, and I said, let's sing some of the old songs. And she dismissed some of them. She dismissed Care Selvi, of all things, as sort of an insignificant song. But when I mentioned Drink to Me Only with Thine Eyes, she said, now there's a good song. And she sang it in perfect pitch, all the words. I mean, they came from somewhere. And at the end of it, she said two things. One, those were marvelous times we lived in. And second was a question, what happened? But it had this power coming entirely from her to restore a fullness of life. I'm sure you've come across, you've lived thousands of examples of this, but what is your sense of what's happening inside a person who's being transformed in some basic, complicated, complete way by harmony, memory, rhythm, all the emotion that comes with it?
I think you're bringing up at least 2 points, if not more here. One has to do with the ability of people, even when they've lost so much of their memory and maybe so much of their mental powers in other ways, to recognize music and respond to it, and perhaps perform it. In in reductive neurological terms, I think this is because music which one has learned well, and not only music, but anything which one has learned well and which has become, in a sense, sort of automatic, although I hesitate to use the word, no longer depends on the cerebral cortex, on the higher parts of the brain. It has got locked away in the cerebellum, the basal ganglia, the lower parts, which are still intact. Now, but all of the emotions and feelings and thoughts and memories which were associated with the music are also locked away. So one really has this indestructible treasure of familiar music and familiar poetry, which I think in a way is there forever. But as you say, it comes from the heart, and one can't reduce the heart to the basal ganglia or anything like this. One responds to music in one's wholeness, it calls on every part of one. One recovers one discovers and recovers identity, I think, very, very completely with music. But then your question also becomes, how do we respond? Why do we respond to art? What the hell is it about? What does it do? And I don't know.
I guess I'm wondering about, from you as a practitioner also, where are we going with musical therapy?
Well, let me be a little more specific. There are different sorts of music and different approaches are of use in different patients. With the frozen Parkinsonian patients who can't move, the rhythm of music is all important, the beat of music, and that'll enable them to move, possibly by analogy with the way in which all of us automatically keep time with music. The music for them doesn't have to be familiar. It doesn't have to evoke any particular feeling. It's a motor thing. With people with amnesia or dementia, especially dementia, the feeling and familiarity of music is all important, as you described so beautifully with your mother. I saw one man who'd had dementia for 13 years or more and he certainly couldn't tie a bow tie beautifully like you. He might just have been able to put on a T-shirt like me, but he probably would have put it on backwards or on his legs or whatever. But he was still able to sing the baritone part of hundreds of songs. He had sung in an a cappella group, and so music was all there for him. I think sometimes with people with frontal lobe problems or autism, they may not be able to express or access any emotion in the normal way, and yet they can be transported, and this is coming back to your transcendence, by the emotion and music. It's as if music gives them what's missing in their brains. And with people with aphasia who've lost the ability to speak, they are often still able to sing and even to sing the words of a song.
Yes.
So this can be a delight for them because it shows they have language, even if the language is embedded in music. And the question is whether one can release it from the music and make it available for them to relearn it again. And in fact, this is something which has been specifically studied here in Boston. And it is possible in many patients, though it requires a huge amount of work.
And now I have a different question. There may be two questions in this too, but this gets back to the question of the matter of transcendence and sort of the language, the music of the spheres, the ultimate music. This is from your friend and mine, Proust. And in The Captive, he listens again to the latest Vinteuil piece, and he's just reflecting, but he says, he's talking with other people. People are chattering around him, and he says, But what were their words, which, like every human and external word, left me so indifferent compared with the heavenly phrase of music with which I had just been communing? I wondered, here's the question, I wondered whether music might not be the unique example of what might have been if the invention of language, the formation of words, the analysis of ideas had not intervened, whether it might have been the means of communication between souls.
That's wonderful. I wish I'd put that in the book.
Well, the second edition.
And that from such a master of language as Proust. Well, language of the heart, language of souls. There's part of me which which sort of rebels against words like the heart and the soul and transcendence, and yet one can't avoid them. Interestingly, William James, to come back to him, never uses the term soul in the Principles of Psychology, but he continually used it in conversational correspondence, and of course he uses it at central in the varieties of religious experience.
But get uninhibited now on the language of, the ultimate mystery. Proust is also asking, what if language were not invented and we just sang to each other, we just danced for each other, or played fiddles for each other or something?
I don't think there's any universal music. Some things are universal. Every culture will agree about octaves and certain divisions of octaves, and these correspond to mathematical proportions. But for example, we think of major keys as jolly and minor ones as sad. You go back 800 years and it may be the other way around. You think of, say, Mendelssohn's violin concerto. This is a very upbeat piece in a minor key, except for a sad portion which is in a major key. There are stories that sort of pygmies in the rainforest hearing Mozart for the first time weep. These are very affecting stories. I don't know if they're true.
I want to believe them.
I want to believe them. And in fact, I think I took a little bit of license in that sentence of mine you read out where I said I think I wrote something about music not needing any mediation. I think it does need mediation. Everything needs mediation. We can't have any contact with the world except through the mediation of our senses, our language, our concepts, and our music. But it's a very strange sort of mediation with music, and it's like nothing else. I'm sorry, we will go forever and never.
No, this is the way language goes. But
yeah.
I want to just tell you very briefly something that happened, and I'll never forget it. When we were making television, we did long piece on two long pieces, completely unconnected, on two wood engravers who lived in New England, Fritz Eichenberg in Rhode Island and Leonard Baskin in Western Massachusetts.
I knew him well, yeah.
Interesting men.
Shortly.
Both interesting men. They didn't like each other, and they practiced the same, carving on end-grained boxwood, very the same thing. But anyway, when I was finishing editing the piece on Fritz Eichenberg, I called him in a panic. I said, Fritz, we never spoke about what's the music of this piece that we should use for introduction. And he said, as if he'd been waiting for me to ask him, he said, well, of course, it's the last song in the Schubert cycle, Die Winterreise, the hurdy-gurdy man who was going out into the snow, into death, into chaos, and he saw himself that way. Several years later, we did this piece on Leonard Baskin, and the same moment came, and I thought, why hadn't I thought of this? I called him. I said, Leonard, what's the music of this piece? And he, again, it was as if I'd been waiting for you to call. He said, well, obviously, it's the Schubert posthumous sonata in B-flat, the one that sounds like, "Oh, come all you faithful," and it goes off. And I thought, now this is telling me something. This is the music of eternity. It's the music of artists who've reflected on everything, who are ready for the end. And in a certain sense, the end is revealed by these unbelievable pieces. How do you account for that? I wish they were. I wish you were there. They were your patients.
Yeah. Certainly I myself respond to Schubert, to all of Schubert, but especially a lot of the songs, more than anything else, in a very different way when I had got into a frozen state after the death of my mother. And I'd moved from mourning into some sort of numb state, hearing some very different Schubert, not the Winterreise, but the earlier cycle, which was full of joy. That suddenly reminded me of good things in life and of being alive. And I wanted to stay with it, but it was music coming out of a basement window, and I had to walk away. But I felt I had to have more Schubert. And then I heard that Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau was going to be in New York and was going to be singing the Winterreise. With difficulty, I got a ticket. It may have been the wrong thing to do, because when I went there, I couldn't react to that, and or maybe the Winterreise was too desolate for someone who was already mourning. One can't, that taught me that one can't command music. It has to come spontaneously. It has to be, as clearly it did to your two artists for whom it was an immediate answer. Late Schubert is about, maybe all music is about life and death, but late Schubert, he was a young man, he knew he was fatally ill, and but nonetheless, I'm not sure that, I don't think music can represent anything outside oneself or anything universal. But it's interesting that these two men who were so different and who disliked each other both homed in on Schubert and late Schubert.
I'm sure you know that that posthumous piano sonata, and I won't sing it, but it does feel like the music of, beyond galaxies. And I wonder if there's any, from a neurologist tools, is there any accounting for what's going on? It's a very,
I had a dream the other night, and dreams one escapes from the shackles of one's own reason and reductionism. And in my dream, I dreamt some Fauré. I didn't know what it was, though when I woke up I realized it was his Requiem. But this, in fact, went with a vision of star nurseries, the sort of things which the Hubble reveals, and galaxies being formed. I don't like words like the beyond or eternal, but maybe one can't avoid them. I may soften up here, but I'm just I'm not sure what to say.
There's another kind of music. I wonder what the brain is doing when we hear music of just pure lyrical perfection.
I want to come back to your previous thing. And again, my feet I'm narrowly, childishly planted in the clinical. I can't talk about transcendence and galaxies. I think of my patients. Now, one of who on the whole do not speak in cosmic terms, but a not uncommon coupling, for example, is of people who see color when they listen to music. They see colors. Sometimes, if they have absolute pitch, it will be associated with the a particular key, but it may also be associated with the pattern, the rhythm, the mood, the melody, whatever. People who have this assume it's universal. When I met the composer Michael Torkey, he described his synesthesia, how when he was 5 years old, he said to his piano teacher, "I love that blue piece." And his piano teacher said, "Blue?" He said, yeah, D major, blue. And his piano teacher said, "Not for me." And he said...
I would have said D major is green, actually.
Well, this
B flat is blue.
Well, he was very shocked that the piano teacher didn't, he assumed it was universal. But 10 years later, he met someone like you who did have a tone-color synesthesia, and he thought they were going to be brothers, but the other man disagreed with him. This is what happened with Scriabin and Rimsky-Korsakov, who were both... Now, this is very real, and you can show that the color constructing parts of the brain are activated at the same moment as various auditory parts. This is not metaphor. Although, and there's some very strange things which metaphor couldn't deal with. So, for example, when Michael Torkey talked about, I think it was G-sharp minor, he says yellow. No, not yellow, ochre. Not ochre, gamboge. And then what he would bring out was, in fact, he could not say the color. It was unlike anything he had seen. And my colleague Ramachandran in La Jolla has described synesthesia with some colorblind people who say that when they're synesthetically stimulated, they may see colors they've never seen, and which they call Martian colors. But certainly whereas Locke and such philosophers thought there was nothing in the mind which hadn't come from the senses, I think there can be things in the mind, starting with color, which don't come from the senses, and this goes right up to heaven, which isn't in the senses.
You remind me of Eugene Lehner, who played 45 years, whatever, the Boston Symphony. I remember doing an interview with him one time, and he walked over and picked up a painting, a postcard of an impressionist painting. He said, "Now, we know where this image comes from. It's a variation on what the man saw. We have no idea where music comes from." But I wanted to pick up on something else there. I mean, in the book, you write that some people see colors, other people get tastes. A major sixth interval is a salty taste,
right,
and a minor sixth may be sweet or whatever.
Yeah. Well, there's a suggestion, and more than a suggestion, there's some evidence that all of us have a fusion or confusion or undifferentiation of the senses in the first year of life, or certainly the first months of life, and then in most people, this things differentiate out and it stops. But in the people with synesthesia, this isn't so.
Could I ask you, I mean, there's the transcendence question, but then now go back to the clinical brain activity with a love song, say, with a could be Sinatra, could be folk melody, but, that's basically about those famous real emotions. What's going on there?
What would you think's going on?
I don't know, except that it's to me it's always a metaphor of the inward, the invisible, the power of something that you couldn't prove actually is there, and it always leads me to all of these nonsense words about mystery and transcendence and whatever.
Excuse me, we're having trouble hearing on the side.
Oop. Maybe you should come down to the front or the middle.
Are we getting too far from the microphones?
Maybe. Sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
What is the music that makes us swoon?
Well, one can show if you do functional brain imaging, very specific responses in the brain to music, which makes one swoon. This has particularly been looked at by a man called Zator up in Montreal, and he speaks of chills in music, music which makes one's hair stand on end. I had this yesterday when I listened to part of Yennefer, this mysterious, uncanny opera of Janáček, and which had overwhelmed me when I heard it about 18 months ago, and it overwhelmed me again. When this happens, all parts of the brain light up, which also light up in love, in orgasm, and with certain drugs, and which are rather dryly called reward systems of the brain. Reward is a very dry term to use, although I want to correlate and say that you get your reward in heaven. The reward, in fact, is a sort of heavenly sensation. It's also a terrifying one. But it's the sensation, if you want, of transcendence, of surrender. Freud would call it oceanic. And whether you see it as regression to something primitive or elevation to something higher, it's probably not uniquely human. In fact, I'm sure it's not. I mean, why else would animals reproduce or do anything? I mean, it's the great motivator of human life. But certainly music can do it. And very, very, very powerfully.
Third kind of music I'd like you to just speak about, and that is, I'm thinking of Afro-Cuban music, percussive, incredibly complex, or Ghanaian drumming, or whatever, that makes our Western tonal 4/4 or 3/4 music seem almost childishly simple. What's our brain doing when we hear Afro-Cuban jazz?
I again have to confess my own narrowness, and that I was brought up in, for me, music is roughly sort of Monteverdi to Shostakovich, whatever. Obviously, in the sort of polyrhythmic music you describe, there is a rhythmic complexity beyond anything in Western European music. On the other hand, there's a relative absence of harmony and melodic simplicity. I don't know that one can make any value judgments, but in general, the brain is more equipped to deal with rhythm than with tonality. Pitch discrimination and tonality can be lost fairly easily with various diseases or damage. One never loses the sense of rhythm, and rhythm is sort of primordial. Primordial. I think of a passage in St. Augustine in the Confessions where Augustine has a young priest, a rather prissy young man, rather inhibited as well, who comes along with him to a gladiatorial contest and is sort of rather sniffy and supercilious until the crowd bursts into a rhythmic chanting. And then the young man is carried away and he can't stop himself joining in. I mean, I think the origin of music, original music, is rhythm. And this is what started up in the human brain 500,000 years ago, and it will finally outlast everything else.
I have a two-part quick question, even though it has two parts, but they're both quick. The first is, do you know if there has been any research into musical therapies for Huntington's disease?
Yes.
You talk in your book about Parkinson's, but I'm interested about Huntington's. And then the second question is, do you know about the singing school movements that occurred here in New England 300 years ago? Singers and writers such as William Billings, who composed an entire literature, as it were, of well, songs that were sung by the people. They were the common man's type of music. And this music is called shape note music, and it's still sung here in New England. I happened to be a shape note singer for 5 years, and I'm proud to say that was one of the best things that ever happened in my life, to learn how to do that kind of music. But that's the two-part question.
Right. On the first question, yes, there has been quite a lot written and looked at, explored in terms of Huntington's and music. I'm sorry I didn't mention that in the book, but I'll see it's in the paperback. Now, with regard to the second matter, we sort of have, I think, have an artificial situation now. I mean, at one time, music making involved everyone. Now we tend to have composers and performers on the one hand and an audience on the other. And what you describe sounds like the sort of communal, even though there may have been a particular composer, it was really the sort of communal immersion in music, which of course one does have in churches, but it's too rare.
This is a comment and a question. This summer I went to a conference and was exposed to the work of a New York analyst whose first name is Bibi and whose second name I can't remember, who spent the last 10 years photographing the interactions of mothers and children, basically to kind of be able to document what attunement looks like and what it doesn't look like. And as I was listening to you talk, attunement. That is attunement, meaning basically the resonance between the mother and the child, such that there's a sense that there's a kind of identity almost, or a kind of finding each other within the mood, the feeling, such that the child feels that it's understood. This is all nonverbal, but this is all kind of, you can see it in the video, what it looks like, and what it looks like when it doesn't happen, when there's a kind of when they're out of rhythm, out of sync. So as I was listening to you talk about first the word social cement, and then the word rhythm, I was thinking, well, I wonder about this. Maybe I wonder about this notion of attunement and the way that this woman sees it and describes it, and what might be going on neurologically in terms of what happens when we experience music. I wonder if there's if you're looking for kind of a substrate from which all this emerges, this seems to be as good a substrate to begin to look at as any. That's the question.
Good question. Thank you.
What is normally established between mother and child fairly early is a sharing of attention so that they will look in the same direction, pointing becomes possible, and what psychologists rather pompously call theory of mind, which depends on a clear idea of self and other. Now, this again is almost uniquely human, or it used to be thought that this was the case. And although it may occur in apes, it's to a much smaller degree. So this is another human thing, along with language, music, and mimicry. Mimicry, gesture, is, having said that, there's an article in Nature recently which showed a macaque monkey saying "nu," or it looked like that. There do seem to be certain gestures, but really idiosyncratic gesture is uniquely human, and one certainly wonders whether theory of mind, sharing of attention, gesture, and music are all tied up pre-verbally. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. In addition to Bach, I'm especially fond of the blues, but I'm afraid my question is a bit more mundane. What is it that's going on when people might typically say, I can't get that tune out of my head? Right. And perhaps a bit less interestingly, Could you maybe comment on the use of jingles in advertising?
Okay, gladly. First, I think that almost all of us, even if we can't command a tune, tend to have tunes and bits of music going through our mind involuntarily for much of the day. And often we suddenly become aware that something has been playing in us for a long while. I think that this sort of involuntary music, which again, as an aside, sort of it wouldn't occur if it didn't have some crucial biological or function. I think while this is partly a sort of counterpoint to our thoughts, our moods, our memories, and is associated with them. But sometimes this inner music can become pathological, it can become broken, and a particular fragment of music, usually not much more than 20 seconds long, starts to loop again and again and again and again, and to lose whatever meaning or beauty or sense it had in the first place. And the music industry in Germany originally called these earworms, and there is a lot of what one wants to call mischievous research on the sort of music which will hook people, sticky music, which will get into the mind, which will invade it and enslave it, and go round and round and round. And it's particularly silly, manipulative music. Sort of theme songs and advertising jingles which do this, although one can also have many high-class sort of Bachian earworms or whatever. Mark Twain wrote a story in the 1870s about such a jingle, which enslaved the hearer, and he found himself moving to it. He finally confessed it to his priest, who then got enslaved, and the priest mentioned it to his congregation, and all of them, people have called these sort of infectious musical viruses. Our musical susceptibility, there is something about the musical parts of the brain which make them prone to helpless repetition. I think you don't see this, on the whole, in other spheres. I mean, it's true that people who have been through some terrible traumatic thing may have flashbacks which recur again and again, but things like this only occur in exceptional circumstances, whereas I think everyone has repetitive music. And I suspect it's becoming commoner because music is ubiquitous, we're exposed to it all the while, and a lot of it is designed to get into us and invade us. And one doesn't always know what to do about an earworm. But I think it's an intriguing problem, and one, incidentally, which is quite real physiologically. If you do functional brain imaging, you can really see this sort of vortex of activity, a nasty sort of electrical parasite going round and round in the brain.
Right. Tell your priest, James. That's the answer.
My name is David. And I like to talk about aphasia in music. I was totally aphasic for 4 years, and recovered over the following 2 years in my 30s. And my first inkling that I had the capacity of music was when this was at Beth Israel in the behavioral neurology unit. Dr. Mesulam came in and said, could you whistle for me? And I could whistle a tune. And he said, do you realize you've used every muscle for language that is needed, but you can't say a word? And that was very intriguing to me, of course. And I wonder why music is accessible, and it took me so long, even though, you know, daily therapy about speech, it took me so long to come to words when music was accessible.
Yeah, that's a very, very moving story, and I'm glad that language has come back so fluently to you now. Whistling. It's much more of the brain is recruited for music and also for mimicry than for language. And even if one has lost expressive language, you can gesture, and you can usually sing or whistle or hum. But I really think this needs to be introduced very early, and not after people have labored fruitlessly at speech. One needs to sort of slyly get round the problem and sort of snag speech into music and move from there, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
About 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to take my second cousin, who came from a disadvantaged family and probably had never heard any classical music in his life. I spent the afternoon with him, and sometime during the afternoon I began humming, and this probably wasn't an earworm, but it was Bach. I began humming a tune from one of the Brandenburg Concerti, I don't remember which one, and I hummed it, and he said, he was 10 at the time, he said, "Sing that again." I thought, okay. I didn't even realize I'd been singing it. So I sang it again. You can't hear? Is that better?
No.
My goodness.
I'm somewhat deaf, and the amplification sort of increases the vagueness, so to speak.
How about this?
No, just speak it out.
Yeah,
okay.
He'll mediate.
Okay. So I was with my 10-year-old second cousin, and I was singing a Bach tune, and he said, "Please sing that again." He had never heard anything like this. So I sang it again, and he said, "No, sing it again." So I did, and he said, "My, that goes back into my brain, back where words can't get to, and makes me think of things I don't usually think about." This was a 10-year-old child who had never heard any classical music, and I said, I was just floored. And, you know, you've alluded to numerous times this evening about how music has these neural networks throughout the brain, and I'm just interested in more of the neurology and why is it that in this child who had never heard any classical music, it went back into his brain, back where words can't get to, and made him think about things that he'd never thought about before?
Yeah, I think I got enough of that. Well, that again is an extraordinary story, and I sort of want to connect it at a low level with the Martian colors, the colors one has never seen. For whatever reasons and whatever mechanisms are involved, I think music does have the power to induce brain states, thoughts, moods, mental landscapes, visions, transcendences, which are without precedent and without parallel, and which cannot be evoked by anything else. And this is not always to people's liking. And I think, particularly in people who demand explanation or demand control, this uncanny power of music can be quite threatening. I'll give you two examples of this. One in Freud, who almost never wrote about music, but in a rather poignant preface to the Moses of Michelangelo, he says that without being a connoisseur, he enjoys literature, he enjoys works of art and sculpture. He said, however, he cannot derive any pleasure from music because he cannot analyze what is going on. Whether, as a child, he enjoyed music before he felt a compulsion to analyze, I don't know. Another example in a different direction is Tolstoy, who was enormously vulnerable to music and ambivalent about it. He adored Tchaikovsky, but he also felt that Tchaikovsky had too much power. And of course, in his novella, The Kreutzer Sonata, the narrator's wife is seduced by a musician and by music, and of course things end with murder, but really the murderer should be the music. Tolstoy often felt music was intolerable because it ushered him into thoughts and states of mind which he felt were not his own and were irrelevant and which he couldn't deal with. But I think this happens with all of us, but it's nice when, as with your 10-year-old child, is welcomed and is not threatening.
Well, I'm a singer and a doctor, so I know about the transcendence of music, but I'm also interested in what actually neurologically is going on.
Tell you in 20 years.
Okay. I'll come back.
Thank you for being here. I wanted to ask, my younger brother has a pretty moderate case of Tourette's, and his tics interfere with everything he does, everything except playing the piano. And it seems that unless he's having a particularly bad day, he can get through a piece of almost any length without ticking. And we've always wondered, we've speculated maybe there's something, hyper-concentration is going on there, or maybe it's because music uses so many parts of the brain. But just wondering what you thought about that.
Bad Tourette syndrome, good pianist.
Yes.
How is it possible?
There's a chapter in my book on Tourette's and music. There are people with Tourette's, and in a way this is almost the opposite of Parkinsonism. Coming back to William James talked about the obstructed and the explosive will. In Parkinsonism, people are obstructed. In Tourette's, there are movements which burst out all the while, often in an uncoordinated way. Listening to music, making music, especially strongly rhythmic music, can enable people with Tourette's to coordinate this. I saw this incredibly recently with a drum circle in New York. There were 30 young people with Tourette's, all of them ticking in their own way, out of synchrony with one another and out of synchrony with themselves. And when the drum circle started, all of them became orchestrated. They became sort of coordinated within themselves and coordinated with each other. There is, although there's a danger, which you also have with Parkinson's, that if the beat is too loud, it may cause a sort of entrainment and a synchronized jerking with the beat. So the beat mustn't be too loud. But there are a lot of musicians, especially jazz musicians, with Tourette's. But there's a pianist in England who, his name is Bloss. He has just written a book called Busybody, and he has severe Tourette's. And I've met him, and he describes how encountering a piano at the age of 9 made an overwhelming difference to his life. There's also a very gifted composer, Tobias Picker, and he has been quite open about this. He has Tourette's, and it seems to enter his creative imagination in very interesting ways. It doesn't mean that he plays agitated, ticky music. In fact, the music can be sweet, pastoral, lyrical. But something like Tourette's, while it can be a distress and a disorder on the one hand, can also be channeled into music and art and acting. And, well, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We know about junk food. Is there such a thing as junk music?
Well, I don't indulge in value judgments much, but Jonathan Miller has sometimes called music orange juice for the ear, but I mean there is certainly music like art which is minor or major, which doesn't sort of there's music which tinkles. But I think, yeah, I mean, I suppose one has low-grade music. I don't know. I hesitate to say this, but I feel they play junk music in the gym where I go to. I feel it's a sort of mindless subcortical thumping. It never seems to go anywhere. It doesn't tell me anything, and but I'm usually able to tune it out. But I suspect there is.
Thank you.
Dr. Sachs, it's an honor to meet you. I have a question along slightly different lines in relation to music as a profession. There's a lot of talk in my profession in classical music about classical music being in trouble, that people aren't going to orchestra concerts anymore, that they're not buying CDs as much. And then I hear about popular music being in trouble as well. And I have heard many different theories about why this is, and was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that in relation to it. I'm so moved by the stories in your book and the stories in this room about how music is so universally effective. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts as to why it's in trouble.
When John Stuart Mill got very depressed at the age of 21 or so, nothing but music could console him. But he then became very afraid that music would run out. That there were a finite number of melodies, and they were rapidly being gone through in the 19th century, and soon there would be nothing left. I really can't, I don't know how to address your question. I know when I originally read Dan Leviton's book, which is a book I saw in manuscript and very much admire, I was a little taken aback that almost all of his musical references were to post-1950 music and almost none to pre-1950 music, and that he seemed to intimate that he thought very few people, only a few old so-and-sos, listened to classical music. I doubt if that's so. But I don't know how to address this. I mean, I suspect that good music will last forever, whether it is polyrhythmic African music or jazz or classical music or whatever.
Thank you.
Good luck. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Sachs. Can you hear me? My question has to do with absolute pitch and synesthesia. I'm a fourth-year student at Berkeley, and I'm plagued with both, it seems. I'm wondering the likelihood that this abnormality is wholly congenital. It's often described by people like Dr. Ramachandran, who you mentioned in your book, as a sort of overzealous dendritic relationship between otherwise unconnected areas in the brain, something that may result from a handicap of the pruning process that takes place during embryonic development.
I'm not quite sure what you're asking me.
Well, I wanted to know, it's been shown in studies that have to do with memory-based subjects, like London taxi drivers, that have grown different parts of their brain, that the mind is more malleable than,
right.
I guess, once thought. And I'm wondering how this would parallel to synesthesia if that kind of plasticity is able to be mirrored in something like those traits.
I'm still not clear about the relation of absolute pitch to plasticity.
Plasticity of brain and absolute pitch,
Right.
and inheritability of perfect pitch.
Okay. First, with regard to absolute or perfect pitch, which are terms I use synonymously, this is the ability instantly to identify and name a note or a key. So you can say G sharp, or that piece is in B minor, as you say the carpet's red. You do this without any external reference. You don't have to look at a spectrum to say the carpet's red. It just is red. All of us have relative pitch to some extent. We can judge a musical interval, but absolute pitch seems to be relatively rare in adults.
Is it inherited?
I'll come to that. It seems to have to occur in about 1 in 10,000 adults. There is some evidence that absolute pitch is universal in infancy, and that it is then pruned out in the vast majority of people unless there is intensive and early musical training, so that in professional musicians absolute pitch is 1,000 times commoner. It's about 1 in 10 or 1 in 12, or unless they speak a tonal language like Thai or Mandarin, which demands in speech a sort of very fine tuning in pitch, and absolute pitch is commoner in Chinese and Thai musicians. It is incidentally commonest of all in people who are born blind. 40 or 50% of those born blind have absolute pitch. And there, its cerebral basis is different, because in those who are born blind, this huge real estate of the visual cortex is available to be filled by other senses. And so hearing and language and music and touch and smell, all become enhanced. There is some absolute pitch can certainly run in families. But these are usually pretty musical families where there's also a lot of early musical training. So in fact, it has been rather difficult to talk about the genetics of absolute pitch.
Do you suspect that it's learnable or obtainable?
No, I don't think it's learnable. I don't think it can be learned by an adult. I think it can be preserved in a child, but that it can't be acquired. That's my impression. That's from what I read. Right. Incidentally, on the subject, the original one of my chapters describes a musical child in the 19th century who used to say, "Only think, Papa blows his nose in G." And this is now the title of a chapter that was going to be the original title of the book. But I felt it was too charming and would cause immediate laughter, and then not be accepted.
I'm looking forward to reading your book. I had an interesting experience when my son was in utero, which was that he was very responsive, as far as I could tell, to lyrical music, and not so much to rhythmic music. And he was transverse, and I needed to try and get him to turn, and I did that with lyrical music. I happen to be someone who drums on a regular basis, and he didn't like that so much, was my strong sense. After he was born, it turns out that he has some pretty severe neurological damage, that he's blind and severely delayed. And he is now 3.5 and nonverbal, but I started taking him to a highly skilled music therapist when he was 5 months old, who works with him improvisationally and responds to his musicality. And he is one of the most connected musical beings I have ever encountered. And he still does not take to rhythmic music. He doesn't move to music. If I put on rhythmic music, he cries. But put on Eva Cassidy, put on a violin concerto, and he is happy. I wondered if you have any comment on that.
Well, it's extremely interesting, and I would love to quote your story in the paperback. I don't know what to make of it, but I suspend disbelief whenever I hear extraordinary things, and this is rather extraordinary. I thought you were going to say that that there was a preferential response in utero to Schubert or to the Winter or something. But this is certainly very interesting and would certainly suggest that tonality can also be be quite primordial.
Yeah. Do you think it's possible that he could develop into rhythmic attunement?
I would think so.
Yeah.
I would think so.
Thank you.
Give me a follow-up.
I'm a musician and I also teach college, and one of the phenomena that I've been noticing in recent years, which I find very disturbing, is the number of students who insist on having a musical soundtrack in their ears 18 or 20 hours a day with the Ipods and the other kind of musical devices. And I think that they are trying to, they're trying to have a musical soundtrack to accompany their lives, I suppose. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about what kind of influence that may be having on them neurologically to be subjecting themselves to that kind of stimulation to such a degree?
Yeah. There've probably been studies. I don't know about them, and I can only sort of cite my own disquiet at this. I mean, now with iPods and with having sort of 20,000 tunes and something the size of a matchbox, in one day or 1 week, a person can have, in a way, more compacted musical experience than someone had an entire lifetime, say 500 years ago. One of my concerns is that, a simple one, is that people may have the music on too loud. And there's been something of the beginning of what looks like an epidemic of juvenile deafness. It's easy to turn the stereo up to 80 or 90 decibels. You want to envelop yourself in music, immerse yourself, put out the external world. The little hair cells in the ear won't take it. Secondly, I'm concerned about an envelopment in music or anything else so great that it tunes out the external world. I think music is a wonderful accompaniment of life. I think it shouldn't be a sort of substitute for life. And I don't know how it is in Boston, but New York is full of functionally deaf people, either with cell phones or iPods, who walk in front of cars or bicycles and get killed or cause accidents. I speak here with some feeling, because just such a person, I encountered just such a person when I was out bike riding a few months ago. I saw this look of really hallucinatory sort of distraction. I rang my bicycle bell, it didn't work. I have a loud klaxon, it didn't work. I have a police whistle, it didn't work. And then she walked in front of me and I went over the handlebars. I'm a little frightened at the extreme facility for total immersion, which goes to excess for, as you say, 18 or 20 hours a day. I also wonder whether it may have some capacity to cause earworms or musical hallucinations, but I don't know. But I think the human nervous system and the human organism is not geared to musical perception for 18 hours a day, and I suspect there may be some price to pay.
Thank you. Two more, and then that's it.
I can't believe you have an English accent. I mean, when I read your books, you don't have an English accent in my head. Wow. What I want to know is, we know how important and beneficial music and creative arts therapies are. They help heal, they help regenerate in therapy and all that junk. I mean, why aren't they promoted more? Why don't more people do that?
Why are the arts
you know?
more for all their value? Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's first, what you say about an English accent is interesting. You know, of course, one's not conscious of one's accent, although I suspect that the fact that I grew up in England and with certain you know, ways of doing things does show in my writing, for better or worse. The New York Times has a section called Arts and Leisure. I dislike the title of that because it would suggest that art is a leisure thing, a luxury, sort of cheesecake. I think the arts are... Yeah, I think the arts are an absolute necessity in life, one way or another. I mean, some people will respond especially to the musical, and others to the verbal, and others to the athletic. Well, you know, and I think athletics is close to art and archery. I think that there are forms of neurological organization which can only be addressed by art and not by anything, and not by sort of logic and reason and systematic things, and by art which is inherently evocative of emotion. I mean, I won't try and define art any more than I would try and define love or anything else. But I think the arts are essential to the human nervous system and in human life, and this was something which the Supermen in Arthur Clarke's science fiction novel didn't appreciate. So, but we need more. But you know, we're in Boston. You should be full of art.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First, thank you for being so generous with your time. I don't know a lot of history, but it seems like in the 20th century, the successful political movements, whether they were for good or ill, like in this country, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, the women's movement, and for ill, the Nazis, all had music that bound them together. Yeah. So I wonder whether evolutionarily one of the functions of music might be that it binds a group together.
Yeah. Absolutely, one would think that. I mean, whether it's with religious music or any sort of communal thing, including martial music, which both invigorates and unites the warriors, and may also strike terror into those they advance on. I think music and musicking together is absolutely one of the strongest binding forces in all sorts of movements. I'm going to finish, since you mentioned sort of music of this sort, by telling you a little story about a French neurologist called L'Ermite. Once told me that he had a little problem with music. He said when he listened to music, he could either say it was the Marseillaise or it wasn't. and I forgot to ask him how he could tell. But I suspect it was only because people came to attention or saluted or whatever. But apart from those who have the rare condition of total amusia, which he had, I think we all have a sort of communal thrill to music. The music associated with patriotism or a movement, even if we despise it intellectually, it will. I think again, this is one of the reasons I'm looking at the organ at the moment. Why religion and traditional religion, is still so powerful. I mean, I'm an old Jewish atheist myself, but I love the traditional chants, and I think chanting together is absolutely primary in human life. Thanks.
Thank you.